Today we're going to talk about ethnic conflict. Why do we see ethnic conflict? Well, instances of ethnic conflict seem to have risen in the world since 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, although interstate conflict, that is to say conflict between states, has declined in this recent period, intrastate conflict, that is to say conflict within a single state, has been on the rise. The decline of superpower competition seems to have popped the lid on simmering ethnic tensions. Russian conflicts in Chechnya, the breakup of Yugoslavia, war in Rwanda, Burundi, Sudan, Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, Indonesia, and others have all broken out since 1989. All of them have featured ethnic groups with grievances related to their status as an ethnic group. So why does ethnic conflict occur? There are several competing theories on this. Maybe people just hate one another and are best kept apart, so people who are too different should not be together in a state. This is a common view, but it fails to really explain all kinds of long-lived, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and peaceful states and communities. Maybe ethnic groups face security dilemmas within a state, whereby people just fear other ethnic groups within the country and therefore choose to prepare for conflict over the state, and they often end up striking first to avoid being attacked. Again, though, this explanation doesn't always do a good job explaining why some groups fear one another and others don't. More importantly, it doesn't explain the timing of conflicts very well, because sometimes ethnic groups who once did not fear each other now do so, Lebanon being a good example of long periods of peace followed by the outbreak of war. Maybe some people have a lot to gain by mobilizing for violence and can successfully dupe others into following them. This is the instrumentalist view applied to ethnic conflict. It can explain why sometimes there is fear and animosity and sometimes there is not, and that's because actors choose to make ethnicity salient at some times and choose not to make ethnicity salient at other times, instead privileging other dimensions of difference. Now, on this view, it's not so much that we see a lot more ethnic conflict, it's just that ethnicity becomes the excuse that people use to initiate and sustain conflict, in the same way that perhaps communism or capitalism was the excuse that people used to initiate conflict prior to the end of the Cold War. It was a convenient narrative through which different belligerents could appeal for aid or appeal for support. And so that's why the conflict took on that dimension. On the other hand, maybe it's just simple opportunism. Rational group leaders will engage in conflict where there's an opportunity to win, and otherwise will bide their time. This is a kind of imbalance in the balance of power explanation. Maybe it's economic resentment, and that's the cause of ethnic conflict. One group may simply not be well recognized or represented within a state, and so it seeks advancement through conflict rather than staying within the system. Right? So if you feel that you are part of a state that never recognizes you and that never will recognize you and never will address your grievances, then perhaps you will take your grievances outside the system rather than navigate within the system. And finally, maybe economic gain is the cause. Perhaps the motivation to capture wealth and resources is what explains the timing of various conflicts. People, in other words, are greedy, and when they see an opportunity and when they see enough wealth on the table, they're going to launch moves to capture that wealth. What does the research say? Well, according to your textbook, some quantitative research indicates that greed, it seems, more powerful explanation than feasibility or grievances. Other more qualitative research indicates that the nature of grievance matters as to whether the conflict breaks out between the state and an ethnic group. So in this view, economic and cultural demands can usually be met, but demands for complete secession trigger conflict. So it's the nature of the grievance that matters. As you can see, these accounts are somewhat in tension with one another, so it's hard to know at the end of the day which is correct. Now, how do we prevent conflict? How do we try and keep ethnic tensions from boiling over into armed conflict? Political scientists have studied some of these ways, and ways in which multi-ethnic and multi-confessional states organize themselves, such as to deal with the demands of the various ethnic groups that compose them. Of course, there's one way to do this, which doesn't involve setting up domestic institutions, and that's just simply to separate, to basically create two states where there were one. The Czechs and the Slovaks did this in 1993 fairly peacefully, but usually doing this is actually quite messy and violent. I'll give you the recent example of Ukraine in 2014 and the breakup of Yugoslavia and the Balkans in 1993-94 were pretty messy affairs. In the case of Ukraine, it continues to be a messy affair. Geographically, ethnic groups will often overlap one another and may each be present in communities down to the local level. So you'll have some of each ethnic group in lots of different communities, and a demand for separation can basically be a demand for clearing out certain areas of ethnic groups, and we call that ethnic cleansing, and it doesn't have a particularly good ring to it these days. Often that will involve killing people. At best, it'll involve relocating people, and at its very best, it'll involve exchanges of population, which are never quite fair, where one town exchanges, say in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, for instance, a town will exchange its Serbian or Croatian population in exchange from Muslims that live in Croatian or Serbian areas, but again, that is rarely a seamless process. Moreover, economically, the ethnic groups that want to secede may end up sharing national infrastructure that can't be easily or cheaply divided. Things like railway lines and road networks that, at the end of the day, may not make much sense to operate across different borders. This is a problem for independence movements in Quebec. Quebec's hydroelectric resources, for instance, can't really easily be divided up. The Basque Country, Catalonia, and Scotland, all of these countries, or all of these would-be countries, faced a problem that much of their electrical infrastructure, much of their road and transport network, road, rail, and air network, all of these are currently functioning on a national level, and they're very difficult and expensive to break up. Now, if we've decided not to break up a country, and if a country wants to preserve itself as a single state, and there are many advantages to working together rather than going your separate ways, there are two models of shared governance that seem to be feasible and seem to have some degree of success. One is the centripetal model, and the other is the centrifugal or consociational model. Let's talk about the centripetal model. The centripetal model is the idea that you want to make political parties more inclusive of different ethnic groups. So in that sense, you want to avoid making ethnicity a political area of conflict and instead increase the saliency of other issues, such as perhaps class divisions, regional divisions, or any other area over which people can have conflict rather than ethnicity. And so in order to make political parties more inclusive, you can try to draw single-member districts that will end up requiring parties to cater to more than one ethnic group if they want to win the district. This doesn't always work if there's only two ethnic groups, but if there's three or more, this can work. But the idea here is to make sure that political parties cannot win office and cannot win control of the state by taking on ethnic demands of one group versus another, because they can never have enough support with just the support of one ethnic group. You can also require political parties to have leaders and candidates from multiple ethnic groups if they're going to participate in elections. Again, so basically in a PR system, right, in a proportional representation system, you make sure that the lists have to include members of all ethnic groups or all applicable ethnic groups. And what that does is that means that no party can split itself by catering to the demands of just one ethnic group. There may be some cost in terms of the freedom of the people to self-organize, but the benefit is that as they do organize, they don't organize around ethnic lines. Moreover, the presence of multi-ethnic parties and multi-ethnic political institutions encourages bargaining and trust across ethnic lines. It forces people from different ethnic groups to get together and talk it out rather than sit behind barricades and fight it out. The other model is the centrifugal model or consociational model. Now, this theory accepts that parties will sometimes form on ethnic lines, but it makes it almost impossible for any single party to rule unilaterally, and we've seen this when we've talked about when we talked about different types of democracies, you can create more or fewer veto points. So this view essentially says we need to avoid parliamentarism and move towards presidential or semi-presidential types of regimes, democracies that ultimately require people to achieve broad consensus in order to rule. So this requires either a parliamentary system where you have to have coalitions of parties in order to make policy. Switzerland and Belgium are excellent examples of multi-ethnic, multi-religious states where you need coalitions of parties to govern, and so rarely will it be, in the case of Switzerland or Belgium, a Catholic or a German party ruling by itself. You will have to have French and Protestant parties helping you out in order to win office and make policy. Or you have an explicit division of ethnic power mandated by the Constitution. What this does is it makes sure that ethnic minorities are specifically represented. Lebanon is one example where the president always has to be Christian and the prime minister always has to be Muslim. And this is basically a way of institutionally making sure that both the Christian and Muslim ethnic groups within Lebanon always have some share of political power. Of course, by making this really inflexible distribution of power, the Lebanese constitution created some problems because the ethnic distribution of power in the country, that is to say the number of Christian and Muslims, has varied over time. There used to be a slight Christian majority in the 1950s and 60s. Today there's a fairly sizable Muslim majority in Lebanon, which means that the Muslims feel like they are underrepresented by the constitutional system that's currently in place, and they are constantly trying to agitate to get more power, something that the Christians are resisting, and this ends up creating more conflict. Another example where you have seats for, or where minorities are allowed some representation, is Iran. In Iran's parliament, there are seats reserved for Jewish minorities and Christian minorities. Not many, and certainly not to the point where there's veto power, so it's not exactly consociational, but it is a way in which you can try to make sure that certain ethnic groups at least have a way to air and voice their grievances to the majority group. The centrifugal consociational model is often associated with federalism. This means that issues that are important to ethnic groups will end up being decided at the local level, where they may have a majority, rather than the national level, where they may not have a majority and therefore not get their way. So installing federalism is a way to diffuse tensions at the national level on important ethnic issues like education and religious holidays and things like that, where at the end of the day, basically local groups can each have their own way and not interfere with one another by each exercising power in a geographic area, which works very well if the ethnic groups are fairly consistently separated geographically. But of course, if they're not, then that might be a problem. Also, many unitary states are afraid of granting ethnic minorities control over particular regions because they're afraid of ultimate secession. They don't want to lose control over territory, and they're worried that if they start down the road of federalism, that might create an impetus for a secessionist movement that they're trying to avoid. But perhaps it could do the opposite. And again, the literature is not speaking of one voice on that issue. Okay, so that's what we talked about for ethnic conflict, the centrifugal and consociational models of ethnic conflict, as well as different explanations as to why ethnic conflict perhaps occurs.